Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over chapters 5 and 6 of J.D. Salinger's classic, The Catcher in the Rye. So, let's see what kind of trouble Holden gets into again, shall we? Alright, let's dive in to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 starts out with Holden telling the reader that on Saturday nights, Pencey would make steaks for all the boys. He goes on to say that the only reason they do this is because a lot of the boys' parents would come on Sunday and ask their kids what they had for dinner, and the boys would be able to say steak, which always impressed them. Holden, however, says these steaks were so dry you couldn't cut into them, and they were also served with lumpy pieces of mashed potatoes, some of the lumpiest Holden has ever seen. He said that for dessert they would always get what was called a brown Betty, but most people didn't eat the desserts except for Allie and maybe the younger kids. He said after dinner there was about 3 inches or so of snow on the ground and it continued to fall, so everyone went outside and started making snowballs and throwing them at each other. He said it was very childish, but it was also a lot of fun. He then tells the reader that he sees a friend of his, Mal Brassard, who is on the wrestling team, and they decide to take a bus into Agerstown and have a hamburger and maybe see a lousy movie. Holden says that neither of them felt like sitting around all night on their asses, and they wanted to do something. Holden asks Mal if he minded if he invited Allie to come along with them. He tells the reader that Allie didn't do anything on Saturday nights, and maybe this would be good for him. Mal says that he doesn't mind, but he wasn't too crazy about the idea either. Holden says that Mal really didn't like Allie all that much. Both of them split off and they go to their rooms and get ready. As Holden was getting ready, he yells across the shower area to Allie and asks if he wants to join them in Agerstown. Allie asks who's going, and Holden tells the reader that Allie always has to know everything and has to know everyone who's going. So Holden tells him, and Allie says, "Hold on while I get ready." As Allie is getting ready, Holden goes over to the window and opens it up and begins to pack a small little snowball. He tells the reader that he was going to throw it at a car, but the car looked really nice, all covered in white snow, so he decides not to. Then he sees a fire hydrant that he might throw the snowball at, but it also looks really nice covered in the snow, so he ends up holding the snowball in his hands. Holden then says that everybody meets for the bus, and the bus driver makes Holden throw the snowball away. Holden says he isn't going to throw it at anybody, but the bus driver doesn't care. Holden then tells the reader that as they went into the town, the only thing they did was really have a few hamburgers and play pinball. This was because the movie that was playing that night both Allie and Mal had already seen, and if that was the case, Holden really didn't want to watch it. This was because Holden says that both of them would laugh like hyenas at the worst part of the movie, and he really didn't like sitting next to them when they did this. Holden says it's about 7:45 when they make their way back to Pencey, and they all head back to Holden's room. Allie lays down on Holden's bed, while Mal desperately searches for some sort of card game, because he really likes to play bridge. After a little while of them talking, Holden then makes up an excuse to get both of them out of the room. He tells them he has to write a composition for Stradlater, so both Mal and Allie leave, and Holden gets into his bathrobe and puts on his pajamas. And he also puts on his red hunting hat and sits down and begins to write the composition. Holden says that as he's sitting there trying to think of an idea of a room or some kind of house to describe, it's really just not coming to him. Finally, he gets an inspiration and begins to write a composition about his brother Allie's baseball mitt. He tells the reader that Allie was his younger brother, and that his brother's baseball mitt was covered in poems that Allie had written on it. That way it would keep him entertained as he was playing the game. Holden goes on to say that Allie got leukemia and died when they were in Maine on July 18th, 1946. He goes on to tell the reader that we really would have loved his brother because he was very intelligent and very nice. He says that every teacher that Allie ever had always wrote notes home to his mother saying just what a joy he was to have in class. And Holden goes on to mention that those teachers actually meant it. He also tells the reader that Allie had red hair. Holden says he thought people with red hair were supposed to get mad very easily, but Allie never got mad at anyone. He also says that Allie had the type of red hair that you immediately noticed it wherever you went, and that one time Holden was teeing off playing golf and he could sense that Allie was behind him. And sure enough, when Holden turns around, he sees Allie about 150 yards away. Holden then goes on to tell the reader that after Allie dies, Holden began sleeping in the garage and that he breaks every window in the garage with his fist. Holden says he doesn't really know why he did it, and his parents were going to have him psychoanalyzed for what he did. Holden says he doesn't blame them at all. And he goes on to say that he even tries to smash out the windows of all the station wagon later that summer, but his fists were already so broken from the garage windows that he was unable to do this. He goes on to say that even now his hands still hurt every time it's about to rain, and that he can barely make a fist with his hands. He says he's fine with that because he knows he's not going to be a surgeon or a violinist or anything of that nature. Holden then switches back to the composition where he realizes that the only thing he is to do is make sure he changes the name of Allie to something else so that way nobody knows it's him and it doesn't bring up any red flags. Holden says he knows that this is not about a room in a house or anything like that, which the paper is supposed to be on, but this is really the only thing that he could write about. He says it takes him about an hour to write this paper because he had to use Stradlater's lousy typewriter, which kept jamming up on him. Holden tells the reader that his typewriter was loaned out to a guy down the hall. Holden says it was about 10:30 when he finishes, and he looked out the window once again. He said it wasn't snowing, but every once in a while you could hear a car somewhere trying to start, but was unable to. He also says you can hear Allie snoring through the shower curtains in the other room. He says that Allie had sinus troubles, which made him snore quite loudly. Holden says that you really had to feel sorry for this guy because not only did he have sinus troubles, but also pimples and lousy teeth and halitosis and crummy fingernails. This is where Chapter 5 ends of Catcher in the Rye. Alright, let's jump into Chapter 6 now. Holden starts off Chapter 6 by stating that sometimes it's hard for him to remember things, and this was kind of one of those times. He couldn't quite remember if he was sitting at the window and looking out, but the reason why he couldn't quite remember is because he was so worried. He tells the reader that when he's really worried about something, he doesn't fool around, and it even makes him have to go to the bathroom, but he can't go because once he gets there, he continues to worry. He tells the reader that he's double dated with Stradlater in the past, so he knows how unscrupulous Stradlater can be. Holden says he remembers the footsteps coming down the corridor and Stradlater coming in asking where the hell everybody was at. It's like some goddamn morgue around here. Holden says he didn't bother to answer because Stradlater knew everybody was either out or having dinner or staying with their parents for the weekend. Holden says that Stradlater begins to undress down to his shorts and hangs the houndstooth jacket back up in the closet. Stradlater then asks Holden if he had written the composition, to which Holden says, it's over there on the bed. Stradlater then goes to the bed, picks it up, and begins to read it. As he's reading it, he's stroking his chest and stomach. Holden says he does this quite often when he's reading something or concentrating. After he finishes, he then complains and says, for Christ's sake, Holden, this goddamn thing is about a baseball glove. To which Holden responds, so what? And Stradlater's like, so what? It's supposed to be at a goddamn room or a house or something of that nature. Holden says, you told me it had to be about something descriptive, and what the hell difference does it make if it's about a baseball glove? This kind of elevates the tension that's already in the room between Holden and Stradlater. To which Stradlater bursts out and basically just says, God damn it, you do everything ass backwards. And he says, no wonder you're flunking the hell out of this place. He said, you don't do a damn thing the way you're supposed to. Holden then says, fine, give it back. And then Holden crosses over to the room, grabs it from Stradlater's hand, and tears it up into a bunch of small pieces. Holden says that after this, they both didn't say anything for a long time, and Stradlater continues to completely undress down to his shorts. Holden says that he lay down in his bed, opened the window, and smoked a cigarette, which you weren't supposed to do in the dorms, but you could do it late at night when everybody was asleep or out. Holden also says he does this because it gets on Stradlater's nerves. It always drives Stradlater crazy when someone breaks the rules around him. Holden mentioned that Stradlater hasn't said a word about Jane or their date yet, to which Holden breaks the tension and finally says, you're back goddamn late if she's supposed to be back at 9:30. And he asks, did you make her sign back in late? Stradlater says that she was just a couple of minutes late, and who the hell cares? She signed out for 9:30 on a Saturday night. This really gets to Holden, and he asks if he took her to New York, and Stradlater responds, are you crazy? How the hell are we supposed to get up to New York and back if she's supposed to be signed out for 9:30? Stradlater then looks over at Holden and says, listen, if you're going to smoke in the room, how about going down into the can and doing it? He said, you may be getting the hell out of here, but I still have to stick around long enough to graduate. Holden ignores him and goes right on continuing to smoke like a madman. Holden then says he turns over and watches Stradlater clip his toenails and make a comment about how everyone in this stupid place only cuts their toenails. Holden asks if Stradlater gave Jane his regards, and Stradlater says, yeah. However, Holden knows that he really didn't do it, because Holden presses him and says, well, what did she say? Did she say anything about keeping all of her kings in the back row? Stradlater says, no, I didn't ask her about that, and what the hell do you think we did all night? Play checkers? Holden says, well, if he didn't go to New York, where did you go? And after a little bit of silence, he begins to worry. He said he has this feeling something had gone funny between them. After Stradlater finishes cutting his toenails, he gets up and goes over to Holden in his shorts and gets playful. He stands over Holden and begins to sock him in the shoulder just for the hell of it. Holden says to cut it out and again asks where he went with Jane if it wasn't to New York. Stradlater says that they just sat in a goddamn car while continuing to give playful punches to Holden's shoulder. Holden asks whose car, and Stradlater responds with Ed Banksey's car. Holden goes on to describe that Ed was the basketball coach at Pencey. He also goes on to say that Stradlater was one of his favorites because Stradlater was center for the basketball team. He also goes on to say that the coaches weren't supposed to let students take their cars out, but he also makes a note that in every school he's ever been to, the athletic team always sticks together. Holden says Stradlater keeps punching him in the arm, so Holden asks, what the hell did you two do? Did you give her the time? In Ed Banksey's car. Holden then presses again, to which Stradlater says that's a professional secret. Holden says that he doesn't really remember the next part so hot, but all he remembers is that he gets up from the bed like he was going to go to to the bathroom, and he tries to punch Stradlater in the face right in the toothbrush that he had inside of his mouth, so it would split his throat open. However, the next thing he remembers is that he was on the floor and Stradlater was sitting on his chest with his face very red. Holden says that Stradlater had his knee on Holden's chest and was weighing him down. Also, Stradlater had a hold on his wrists, so Holden couldn't take any more socks at him. He does remember Stradlater screaming at him, "What's the matter with you?" And Stradlater's face was getting redder and redder by the second. Holden tells him to get his lousy knees off of his chest and says to go on, get off of me, you crummy bastard. Holden says he wouldn't though, and kept holding on to Holden's wrists, as Holden was calling him a son of a bitch. Holden says to Stradlater that he thought Stradlater would give the time to anybody he felt like, and he told that he didn't even care if girls kept all their kings in the back row or not, and the reason he didn't care was because he was a goddamn stupid moron. Stradlater is getting very upset and continues to hold him down and tells him to shut up. Holden says, "You don't even know if her first name is Jane or Jean." Stradlater says, "If you don't shut up, I'm gonna slam you one," and Holden just tells him to get up off of him. Stradlater repeats himself, and finally, Holden says yes, he's not gonna do anything. Stradlater gets off of Holden, and Holden notes how much his chest hurt from Stradlater's knees being on him. And Holden again says that he was a dirty, stupid son of a bitch. Holden notes this really got him mad, and he warns Holden to shut up, and he's not gonna ask him again to do so. Holden eggs him on, and with this, Stradlater turns around and socks him one right in the nose. Holden says the next thing he remembers is that he was on the floor and he wasn't sure if Stradlater had knocked him out or not, but he didn't think so. He looks up and sees Stradlater standing right above him with a toilet kit under his arm. Stradlater says, "Why the hell don't you shut up when I tell you to?" and that he sounded nervous when saying this. He also tells Holden, "You asked for this," and that Holden should go wash his face. Holden tells him that he should go wash his face, which he knows was a childish thing to say, but he was mad at hell at that point. Stradlater then walks out of the room down to the bathroom. Holden continues to sit on the floor for a few more minutes until he could hear his roommate down the corridor. Finally, he got up to find his hunting hat and put it on, and then went to the mirror. Holden notes that he had a lot of blood and gore on his face, and that he was half scared but also half fascinated by this. He said the blood made him look sort of tough, and that he'd only been in about 2 fights in his life and lost both of them. Holden tells the reader that he's not very tough, and he's actually a pacifist. He then goes on to say that he probably had a feeling old Ackley had heard everything and was awake. So he goes through the shower curtains and into Ackley's room, which he usually never does because of the smell. This is where chapter 6 ends. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, stay lit.